Thanks for coming along tonight, where Tom Gilling makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. He was last year talking about the Battle of Kapyong in Korea, which was a very important battle, and he's here tonight on his most recent book. Now, I'll introduce him briefly. He's an acclaimed novelist, but he's really here tonight for a work of non-fiction. So I'll talk about his fiction. He's the author of Lost Battalion, Project Rainfall, Battle Bastard Behind the Lines, Witness, and The Diggers for Kapyong, and now on the occasion of Start Digging, You Bastards, the turning point of the Second World War. So at the topic now, his other background is in journalism. He used to work for the Sydney Morning Herald, the Bulletin, now does freelance for the Australian. And we've given the topic tonight as Beating Rommel at Alamein, the role of Australia and New Zealand in the defeat of the Axis in North Africa. Tom Gilling, you're very welcome.
Thank you, and thank you very much for coming. So, Gerard's given you the title. Private Ken Ward Harvey was lucky to survive his first encounter with the enemy at the Battle of El Alamein. Ward Harvey, a sapper with the 2nd 7th Field Company, had been sent out with orders to destroy 3 disabled British tanks to prevent their use by the enemy. The sappers soon found the tanks, which had already been hooked up by the Germans with steel cables ready for towing away. "We were carrying 20 pounds of explosives on our backs to blow up the tanks," Ward Harvey recalled. "One of our fellows got in and dropped his bundle into this tank and it went up. The blazing tank immediately attracted enemy fire, forcing the platoon to go to ground." As a new chum, the 21-year-old was paired with an experienced soldier who barked at him to keep his head down and take that bloody pack of explosives off your back. Ward Harvey might have been keeping low, but the pack was high above the ground and waiting to be hit. If that had happened, not only me, but anyone near me would have gone up. So I took it off. And then I said to him, "What are those things going ping, ping, ping?" He said, "They're bullets and they're bloody close." 2 weeks earlier, the port of Tobruk, held for most of 1941 by the 9th Australian Division, had fallen tamely to German and Italian forces led by the charismatic and brilliant Erwin Rommel. Since then, German tanks had advanced hundreds of kilometres across the North African desert. The skies above Cairo turned black with smoke from bonfires from the British Embassy, where officials were busy incinerating documents. With Hitler's forces almost within striking distance of the Suez Canal and the great Persian oil fields vital to the Allied war effort, Britain's position in the Middle East seemed to be on the verge of collapse. The Italian dictator Mussolini was so convinced of the Allies' imminent defeat that he flew to Libya to lead the victory march to Alexandria. He went home disappointed. The British commander, General Sir Claude Auchinleck, decided to make a last-ditch stand at El Alamein, an isolated railway halt 230 kilometres west of Cairo. But demoralised British troops had little confidence in their ability to hold back Rommel's panzers. As German tanks rumbled towards the Alamein line, Allied soldiers streamed back from the front. Only one division was moving in the opposite direction, the 9th Australian Division, under its rugged commander, Lieutenant General Leslie Moorhead. The diggers had been training in Syria, far from the front line, when news came through that Tobruk, where so much Australian blood had been shed, had fallen. Lieutenant Philip Marsel of the 2nd 28th Battalion remembered a moment of silence, followed by an avalanche of sound, thousands of voices united in a cry compounded of disbelief, disgust and dismay. To many diggers, it felt as if their sacrifice had been in vain. A cold hand was on the heart of every man who had fought there. Every man felt sick, miserable, bewildered, a soldier of the 2nd 48th Battalion recalled. This was a bitter pill to swallow. This place where a half-trained, poorly equipped division had held out for 8 months, and which mates had bled and died to hold, had now fallen to the Germans in a single day. As the 8th Army threatened to disintegrate around him, Auchinleck summoned the Australians back from Syria. Their recall to the front line was so sudden that of the division's 3 infantry brigades, only one, the 24th Brigade, would go into battle having practiced techniques of mobile desert warfare. Since 1882, when the British occupied Egypt to protect their financial and strategic interests, the The Alamein line had been recognised as the best position from which to defend the Nile Delta and the Suez Canal against attack from the west. Extending from the Mediterranean Sea coast to the northern edge of the Qattara Depression, it straddled the narrowest part of the coastal belt. Digging in was possible in a few areas of sand or sandy soil, but the ground was generally rocky, and excavating to any depth was nearly impossible without power tools and explosives. From the road and railway running along the coast, the desert climbed gently towards a southern escarpment that fell away to the impassable salt marshes of the Qattara Depression, more than 200 metres below. In the past, Rommel's preference had been to use his tanks to outflank Allied defensive positions on the desert side, but the Qattara Depression made this impossible. At Alamein, movement was funneled into a tight corridor that could not be outflanked. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 drastically altered Australia's perspective on the war. No longer just a war to defeat Hitler, it was now a war to defend Australia against the threat of Japanese invasion. The 6th and 7th Australian Divisions were both recalled from the Middle East to meet the Japanese threat in the Pacific, and it seemed inevitable that the 9th Division would follow. When the Australian convoys turned south at Homs, many diggers were still hoping they would go home, but Corporal Tom Derrick, who would later win a Victoria Cross, guessed correctly that they were heading for the desert. "It now looks as though we're bound for an engagement with Mr. Rommel," Derrick wrote in his exercise book. "The boys continue to remain in high spirits, and I believe they would welcome a go-on with Jerry." The road to the front line was clogged with traffic crawling in the opposite direction. One digger recalled passing vehicles of every description, 2 and 3 abreast. There were South Africans, Indians and Tommies, every rank from private to general. This was the silent procession of a broken, beaten army. They were beyond caring. War correspondents seeking information from the haggard and half-asleep soldiers were met with blank stares. Ward Harvey remembered thinking, "This isn't looking very nice." It was just absolute nose-to-tail vehicles coming back, and all the English fellows were saying, "You're going the wrong way, chum. Jerry will get you." By the time they reached the front, the Australians had been on the move for 5 days straight. They had travelled more than 1,300 kilometres with little opportunity to sleep, but their morale, a member of the 2nd 48th Battalion wrote, had never been higher. Within hours of their arrival, the diggers were put to work building new fortifications. The 2nd 48th Battalion worked in relays, some men sleeping while the rest shovelled. A sandstorm blew continuously for 4 days. "All the boys working like Trojans and making great progress," Tom Derrick wrote in his diary. With Rommel holding his ground, the 24th Brigade took up positions on a long east-west rise about halfway between the sea and the Qattara Depression. The brigade was digging and mining its new base when orders came down to organise a raid against enemy positions on a ridge to the southeast. It would be the Australians' first taste of action since their return to the line. The job went to D Company of the 2nd 43rd Battalion. The raiding party, led by 4 officers and including 20 sappers of the 2nd 7th Field Company, had orders to destroy enemy anti-tank guns, blow up derelict tanks and vehicles, obtain information and capture prisoners. It was clear that the Germans were nervous and expecting trouble. Before long, the sky was lit up with red and green flares. Although the enemy position appeared to be strongly held, the defenders were in no mood to fight. By 3 a.m, the raiding party was back at the assembly area, having killed 15 enemy soldiers and taken 9 prisoners. Ward Harvey and his fellow sappers had destroyed 4 anti-tank guns, 1 field gun, along with 3 disabled British tanks and 6 tractors. The raid was a resounding success, a demonstration of the Australian fighting qualities that would be desperately needed in the grinding battles ahead. The New Zealanders were quick to send their congratulations, the commander of the Armoured Corps signalling, "Well done, a great start for the Australians and a most useful raid." Word of the raiders' exploits soon got around the division. Tom Derrick recorded that the 24th Brigade patrol last night met with a fair amount of success, and General Morshead visited the 2nd 43rd Battalion to congratulate Captain Jeans and his men. The Germans were unnerved by the raid, which they misread as a major attack. Fearing deep penetration of their lines, German commanders rushed half the 21st Panzer Division's tanks into the area to meet the illusory threat. Rommel himself was worried enough to issue orders to his forward officers to stay awake all night to ensure their units were not taken by surprise. The 7th of July raid was the diggers' introduction to a brutal contest between the Axis and Allied armies that would continue for the rest of the month and then subside before erupting again in October in a titanic battle whose outcome would alter the course of the Second World War. A series of botched Allied assaults in July led Rommel to conclude that Auchinleck had lost all taste for future attacks. He hadn't, but after his disastrous setback at a place called Ruin Ridge, which ended with the loss of an entire Australian battalion, it was clear that the 8th Army would need to be stronger, better trained, and better led before it attacked again. Auchinleck resisted repeated demands by Churchill to go back on the offensive, arguing that a lack of resources and the consolidation of enemy positions made a breakthrough impossible. Predicting that conditions conducive to an Allied offensive were unlikely to occur before mid-September, Auchinleck told London, "Our policy will be defensive, including thorough preparations and consolidations in the whole defensive area. In the meantime, we shall seize at once any opportunity of taking the offensive suddenly and surprising the enemy." This wasn't good enough for Churchill, who immediately resolved to fly to Egypt in order to shake up the failing command of the Middle East theatre. The prospect of offensive operations being put on hold until mid-September only confirmed his belief that the 8th Army needed a new man in charge. Arriving in Egypt on the 3rd of August 1942 in a converted 4-engined Liberator bomber, Churchill wore the uniform of an RAF Air Commodore and was described as looking cherubic and being in great heart. He wasted no time sacking Auchinleck from the dual roles as commander of the 8th Army and chief of the Middle East Theatre. Churchill wanted to replace him with General William Gott, but after Gott's plane was shot down over the desert, the Luftwaffe intercepted Allied signals traffic and sent 6 Messerschmitt fighters to kill him. The job of 8th Army commander went to General Bernard Montgomery. On the 13th of August, Montgomery summoned staff officers to a meeting to hear how he intended to defeat Rommel. His speech, delivered without notes, was described as electric by those who heard it. Montgomery told the assembled officers that he was committed to destroying the Axis army in North Africa. There would be no retreat from Alamein. He fully expected Rommel to attack, and while he would prefer it not to come within the next fortnight, after that he would welcome it. In the meantime, he would start planning the offensive that would lead to a final victory in Africa. Montgomery touted his credentials as the son of an Anglican Bishop of Tasmania to obtain an Australian slouch hat, but nobody showed him how to wear it. Members of an Australian artillery regiment were said to have regarded Montgomery as a prize galah when they saw him wearing the hat jammed down on top of his head, while British tank officers were aghast at the sight of their commander wearing an Australian bush hat festooned with regimental badges. It was only after they convinced him of the impracticality of wearing a bush hat in a tank that Montgomery was persuaded to wear the Royal Tank Regiment's black beret that became his signature wartime headgear. The Australians immediately took to Montgomery. Sergeant Ken Pantlin remembered Montgomery as a breath of fresh air. He did come and speak to all the troops, told them what was going to happen, explained exactly what the tactics were and what the strategy was, spoke to them all, answered questions and made his presence known. Before El Alamein, every soldier was told exactly how the battle was going to be fought. Every soldier, and the principles that he laid down were followed. During a visit to the 9th Division, Montgomery saw some Australian gunners standing beside one of the Army's new 6-pounder anti-tank guns and asked them what they thought of it. The diggers told them they had not fired it, but they were not allowed to practice with live ammunition because it was scarce and kept for use in battle. Within a day or two, an order arrived from Army headquarters that every 6-pounder gun was to fire off half its ammunition stock in practice. Unless the men are trained to shoot, Montgomery's memorandum said, we shall do no good on the day of battle, however great the number of rounds we have saved for that day. The 2.5 months between the start of August and late October 1943 were a rating game, during which the two sides built up equipment and supplies in preparation for what both commanders knew would be the decisive battle of the Desert War. In mid-September, the 51st Highland Division, newly arrived in Egypt, was affiliated with the Australians for a crash course in desert warfare. Scottish infantry, cavalry, artillery and engineer units were partnered with their Australian equivalents. The Scots had a lot to learn. During a night patrol, one Highlander souvenired a wooden box, only to discover when he got back that it contained a fully primed landmine. The 51st Division officers found that the men in slouch hats had a very different type of discipline from ours. But in the line, our men learned very valuable lessons from those fine troops. The Aussies kept their weapons scrupulously clean and always free from sand. Their slit trenches were prepared with the utmost care, and each trench was completely equipped with such things as grenades. Before a party left on patrol, each member of it was searched thoroughly for any identification marks. By night, silence was enforced and no lights were allowed. When a patrol returned from its job, a complete account of its investigation and acquired information was recorded on a map. And such maps, combined with air pictures, gave the most detailed information of the enemy's minefields and other defences. The Highlanders soon learnt to drive their vehicles more slowly to avoid churning up clouds of dust that would give away their movements to the enemy. The arrival of the 44th and 51st Infantry Divisions, as well as the 8th British Armoured Division, increased the significant advantage in both men and equipment that Montgomery already had over his adversary. Between the start of August and late October, Allied ships unloaded more than 1,000 tanks, including more than 300 Shermans and 9,000 other vehicles. Although altogether the combat strength of the 8th Army numbered around 220,000, while Rommel could call on less than half that many. 54,000 Italians and roughly the same number of Germans, thousands of whom were support rather than fighting troops. The topographic features that had led Auchinleck to choose El Alamein for his last line of resistance were the same features that Rommel would be able to exploit against an offensive by the 8th Army. Since the line could not be outflanked to the south, the attacking army had to assault and break through the enemy defences. The devastating effectiveness of the Desert Air Force and Rommel's precarious supply of petrol meant that he could not risk a mobile defence and was committed to mounting a static defence behind thousands of metres of interlocking wire and mineral minefields. In addition to roughly 500,000 mines, Rommel claimed that his engineers had wired up vast numbers of captured British bombs and shells for use as booby traps. In the event of a concentrated Allied attack on any part of the line, the panzer and motorised divisions above and below the threatened sector were to converge and drive off the attackers. On the delicate issue of his surrender-prone Italian allies, Rommel noted that Italian troops at Alamein were interspersed with their German comrades, so that an Italian battalion always had a German as its neighbour. The depth and complexity of the German defences dictated a night attack, but Montgomery's tanks needed moonlight. So did the engineers, whose task it was to clear a path through the enemy minefields. The September moon would leave too little time to train an army for such a massive assault, so the decision was made to wait for the next full moon on the 24th of October. The offensive would begin on the night of the 23rd of October, 1942. Although the Australian contingent at El Alamein made up just 11 of Montgomery's 94 infantry battalions, some 12,000 troops, the diggers would be crucial in determining the outcome. The 2nd New Zealand Division was recovering from the heavy casualties it had sustained in the weeks and months before the final battle. The 4th Indian Division was considered too flaky, and the 51st Highland Division was still finding its feet in the desert. The 9th Australian Division would fight on the right of the line, the place traditionally entrusted by a commander to his fiercest and most capable troops. Montgomery's plan, codenamed Lightfoot, was designed to trap and destroy the Axis forces in their own defensive positions. It envisaged simultaneous attacks against the enemy's northern and southern flanks. In the primary attack, Infantry divisions in the north, led by the 9th Division, would smash through the enemy lines, destroying all his guns. British armoured divisions would then surge unopposed through the breach and capture the main enemy supply routes, sucking in and destroying Rommel's panzer divisions. At the same time, a joint attack in the south by infantry and tanks would draw off Rommel's armour before moving against his rear areas, capturing supply and maintenance facilities and seizing control of the airfields. The official history detailed a number of ruses designed to keep the Germans guessing about the coming attack. Vehicles drove up and down the southern road, towing chains to simulate the clouds of dust raised by military traffic. Dummy roads and pipelines were constructed, or at least started, under the gaze of German observers on high ground, in keeping with an imaginary schedule that would not have seen them finished by the October moon. Enemy spies in Alexandria and Cairo were fed false information and logistic arrangements, indicating that the 8th Army would not be ready for an October offensive. Forward troops continued to be sent on leave to both cities until almost the day of the attack. As the sun set on the 23rd of October 1941, thousands of diggers emerged from the narrow slit trenches in which they had been hiding all day. Stiff and hungry, they had been ordered to lie doggo since coming forward the previous night, unable to show themselves lest they alert the enemy to the impending attack. We dug a hole in the ground, only big enough to lay down in, and pulled a grass mat of some sort over ourselves, Charlie Cutler recalled. And we lay in that hole for the whole 12 or 14 hours of daylight. A few seconds before 9:40 p.m., pinpricks of light glittered on the desert horizon, far behind Allied lines, followed by the dull rumble of gunfire. Shells from the British long-range guns were timed to hit their targets at the same moment as the main barrage from more than 400 25-pounder and 48 medium guns. Opening on the stroke of 9:40 p.m. and lasting for exactly 15 minutes, the barrage against the enemy gun positions was on a scale not seen since the previous war, an Allied gun every 17 metres, each gun firing 2 rounds a minute. It was said that the din could be heard in Alexandria, more than 100 kilometres away. At the same time, bombs tumbled down on the enemy lines from waves of Wellington bombers. Joe Madeley thought that there would be no German left alive, except for a few suffering from shell shock. He expected the Australians to walk right over the top of them. The battle lasted for a week. The success of Montgomery's attack relied on effective cooperation between Allied infantry and tanks, something rarely achieved in the Desert War to date. During the final spasm, the Australians beat off a desperate counterattack by German forces at a place called the Saucer. The 2nd 24th Battalion was reduced to fewer than 150 men, fueled on benzodrine tablets, who went without sleep for 9 days and nights. 20-odd trucks arrived to take the survivors away, but only 4 were needed. Morshead described the German onslaught on the Saucer as one of the most determined attacks ever made against 9 Australian Division. In defeating it, the diggers inflicted a crushing blow on the enemy. Captain Marsel of the 2nd 28th considered noon on the 1st of November 1942 to be the decisive moment in the Battle of El Alamein. The 9th Division had done exactly what Montgomery asked of it. By dragging enemy divisions north and holding them, the diggers made it possible for Operation Supercharge, the breakthrough by British tanks, to succeed. At 3:30 p.m. on the 4th of November, Rommel gave the order for a general withdrawal to Fuka. By the following morning, it was clear across the entire front that the enemy was in full withdrawal. The 2nd 28th Battalion's war diary reported that the battalion ceases to be operationally engaged. Nobody is sorry to relax and to taste the sweets of victory. It has been a long and grim battle. That day, the 5th of November 1942, quietness descended on the brigade sector. General Oliver Leese visited 24th Brigade HQ, accompanied by General Morshead. Leese made it clear that the 1st of November had been a critical day in the Battle of El Alamein, and the Australian defence of the Saucer had provided the opportunity for the breakthrough by British armour. The Axis army was beaten. Wire intercepts suggested the Africa Corps had lost approximately 1,150 men killed, nearly 4,000 wounded, and more than 8,000 captured. Fewer Italians were killed or wounded, but nearly 15,000 Italian soldiers surrendered. Total Allied losses were around 13,500 killed, wounded, and missing. Within hours of the victory at Alamein, Montgomery had already lost the opportunity to overtake and block the Axis forces retreating along the clogged coast road. Obsessed with breaking through, the Allied commanders were unprepared for the chase. Fuel shortages, minefields, missed maintenance, confused and exhausted crews, the difficulty of moving over the desert night, and even rain, all were offered as reasons for the failure of Montgomery's armoured brigades to cut off and destroy Rommel's army, which scrambled all the way back to Tunisia without ever being seriously threatened with encirclement. 4 days after the victory at El Alamein, the Allies opened a second front in North Africa. On the 8th of November, a combined force of more than 100,000 British and US troops under the American General Dwight Eisenhower invaded French North Africa in Operation Torch. 6 months later, the two Allied armies in North Africa linked up in Tunisia. By then, Rommel had been recalled by Hitler to Germany. On the 13th of May, 1943, the Italian General Giovanni Messa surrendered to the Allies, marking the end of the Desert War. Churchill remarked afterwards that before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. Australians made up 10% of the 8th Army's strength at El Alamein, but suffered more than 20% of its casualties. More than 600 men killed and nearly 2,000 wounded between the 23rd of October and the 5th of November. The northern sector of the battlefield, where the 9th Division did most of its fighting, was like a mill, Rommel wrote later. Everything that went into it, regardless of quantity, was ground down to dust. Unlike the Australians, who sailed home after the Battle of El Alamein and would soon be fighting in New Guinea, the 2nd New Zealand Division stayed on, taking part in the pursuit of Rommel's army across North Africa. By the time the Axis forces capitulated, nearly 3,000 New Zealand soldiers had died in North Africa, and more than 7,000 had been wounded. Another 4,000 had been taken prisoner. Rommel always regretted having allowed the New Zealand Division, which he considered among the elite of the British Army, to slip through his fingers in June 1942 when he had it cornered. "I should have been very much happier," he wrote later, "if it had been safely tucked away in our prison camps instead of still facing us." Montgomery never forgot how much he owed the 9th Australian Division for his triumph at El Alamein. 22 years after the war ended, in what would be his final trip abroad, Montgomery visited the Alamein War Cemetery in Egypt to mark the 25th anniversary of the battle. According to his biographer Nigel Hamilton, the visit prompted Montgomery to tell a former staff officer, "The more I think back, the more I realise that winning was only made possible by the bravery of the 9th Australian Division. I do not know of any other Allied division who could have done it. I must go to Australia and gather the 9th Division together so that I can thank them properly." Montgomery died before he could make the trip. Thank you.
So thanks for that. Very important paper. Tell us about the men who left. So these were the 2nd AIF who the Menzies government committed to the African theatre.
Yep.
What was the attitude of Curtin then? The Labor Party wanted the troops to stay in Australia, is that right? Or?
Curtin wanted the troops back after the Japanese entered the war to fight the Japanese in the islands north of Australia. And the 6th and the 7th Divisions came back. The 9th Division stayed, and just on the eve of the October battle, so the battle lasted really from July until October 1942, just before the October battle, Morshead was told that the troops had to go home, and so this was conveyed to Auchinleck, and he said he couldn't spare them. So he accepted that Curtin and the Australian government had the right to call back its troops at any time, but he made it clear that he could not win what was going to be a vital battle without the Australian 9th Division, and the Australian government agreed to let him keep them until the battle was over, and then they came back shortly afterwards
But
to Australia.
when they were sent, did Labor support the deployment of forces when they left Australia?
I think it was supported for several divisions to go over there.
Okay. So,
You mentioned the Indian division was considered flaky. Is that the same Indian division that fought at Monte Cassino later? And if so, what transformed them?
I could not answer that question, I'm afraid. I don't know whether it was the same one that fought at Monte Cassino, but I mean, they performed a very significant role, and they were often given difficult tasks. But I think, by comparison, especially with the Australians and New Zealanders, they were less staunch. But they suffered many casualties. They fought very bravely, but I think that was a widespread opinion at the time. But there's no doubt that the commanders of the 8th Army were very grateful for what the Indians had done, and they were often put in difficult positions. But so that sounds like a more disparaging comment than perhaps it was.
Hi. In your book, you have a photograph of an Australian digger with a cigar that Winston Churchill gave him at Alamein. Can you tell us a bit about why Churchill was there? Was it after it was all over, or did he go in there to rally the troops? And how did an Australian digger get a cigar from Winston Churchill?
He came over to sack all the hopeless British commanders who had largely been given the runaround by Rommel back and forth across North Africa for many months. He arrived. The troops were all very, very excited to see him, and one Australian, the fellow in that photograph, is said to have run after him, shouting, "Give us the cigar, Winnie!" And when he lifted it out, he said, "Kiss it then." And so Churchill did give it to him, and he was photographed there. He was toothless, unshaven. He wasn't a model of the Australian soldier, but he did get the cigar.
As far as I'm aware, Rommel was held in high esteem by both sides.
Certainly.
The reading that you gave us, I got the impression that maybe your opinion of him isn't that high.
No. My opinion would be. I would not want to be facing his armoured divisions for sure. No, he was certainly held in great esteem by both sides, and indeed. Word did have to be sent around the Allied side to stop making such positive comments about Rommel. He was actually the enemy, and it was bad for morale to keep celebrating his achievements. But no, he was a great commander of mobile desert warfare, and all the Allied commanders until Montgomery were given a lesson by him.
From your talk, the 9th Division is certainly an extraordinary formation, 17,000 or so. What elements or constituents go into training and leadership and moral qualities to develop such an extraordinary fighting formation?
Well, I think my reading of that would be that it was that experience at Tobruk where they were a greatly outnumbered force, besieged for 8.5 months in Tobruk. Very aggressive leadership from a commander who initially was rather intimidating, but whose commitment to discipline was largely, I think, the cause of the effectiveness of his division. So one principle that he instilled in them was at Tobruk, and that they then took to El Alamein, was that no man's land should always be Australian. So if you've got one army which refuses to acknowledge that there will be neutral ground between the two armies and insists on dominating no man's land, as the Australians always did, so they were very aggressive forward patrollers. They would never It was very difficult for the Germans to get close to the Australian lines because the Australians were so aggressive at patrolling the whole of no man's land. And so I think the experience of having survived and of having defeated all of Rommel's attempts over 8 months to take Tobruk instilled a kind of camaraderie and a respect and a confidence and a trust in Morshead's leadership that was largely reflected in their performance later at Alamein.
As I understand, there were some Polish troops fighting in Tobruk together with Australians.
Correct.
Could you perhaps say a few words about what their role was?
I think the Australians were brought out in stages. Most of them were brought out before the siege was finally broken, but there was still one Australian battalion that was there for the duration. But the Poles came in to replace some of the Australians after they came out. There were South Africans there as well. South African command after the Australians left, and they were there at the end when Tobruk did fall.
Thank you very much for your reading today. Very inspirational and stirring and somewhat timely, given that the British, as I understand it, up in Darwin at the moment with their major aircraft carrier, so rather timely, if I may say so. Could you please explain a little bit more about what Montgomery said when he got to Africa and you described as an electric speech that impressed everybody?
Well, the most important thing was that he made it clear that there would be no retreat from Alamein. So it was Auchinleck who'd set the line at Alamein, but even while the Allied troops arrived back, Auchinleck was already making plans for a further retreat to Suez and possibly even beyond. Now, he always claimed that was just sensible planning, that he never actually put it into effect, and he didn't intend to put it into effect. But nevertheless, it was known in the army, word got around that plans were being made, that ships were moving out of Alexandria, that preparations were in train for there to be a further retreat. Obviously, not something that was going to inspire any confidence in an army that had been told that this was where they were making their last stand. So I think the first thing is that he made it clear there would be no retreat first, and second, that we will win. One of the things I found, one detail I found very interesting about his arrival was that he'd been in there just a matter of days, and he looked at the map. He hadn't had time to drive across the whole front, and he pointed to some high ground towards the south, and he said, the Germans will take that, and we'll let them, and then we will take it back from them, but that's where the key fighting is going to be. And others were astonished that Montgomery, having been in the country 5 minutes, was able to pick exactly the site of what would turn out to be a crucial battle. So he was obviously a brilliant general, often I think damned with faint praise that he had a much bigger army than Rommel had by the end, that he waited to build up his forces until he couldn't really be defeated. And there's some truth in that. But it was also true, as the Axis commanders recognise, he was never defeated. And there weren't many generals who went through the war without having suffered a defeat.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm just wondering, how many of the soldiers were volunteers versus permanent army? And secondly, we keep seeing surveys now about how large numbers of young people would not volunteer now to serve. And I'm just wondering if you could give me a few clues as to why the volunteers did volunteer.
Well, I think that's a very good question. There were no militia units there, so they were all the 2nd AIF, so they were all volunteer soldiers. Some of them obviously had been professional soldiers before. As to why they volunteered and people might now younger people might be more reluctant to. I suppose you'd have to look at a sense of commitment to the empire and that became the Commonwealth, which obviously is much looser now if it exists at all. And there was a much greater instinctive sense that if Britain had its back to the wall, then Australia should be there fighting with them. Beyond that, I don't know what it would be, but I think you're right. I mean, I think that an army that called for volunteers, I think we only have to look at the size of the professional army and how difficult it is actually to keep professional soldiers in the army, to extrapolate from that if there was a case where volunteers were needed, it might be very difficult to get them.
I've got a Zoom question here from Greg, who asks, what part did the ultra code breaking play in the success of the battle?
Played a huge part.
So you might just tell us ultra code breaking.
So the ultra code was the code breaking that had been done in Bletchley in Britain. And it meant effectively that Auchinleck and Montgomery after him had advance warning of all Rommel's moves. In fact, it was said sometimes that Montgomery knew what Rommel was going to do before Rommel had been given his own instructions, or before he'd handed out his own orders. It had to be carefully used because ultra secret intelligence like that, if you reveal too much how much you know of the enemy's secret intelligence, then they'll change their codes and they'll know that someone's listening in. So it was used quite sparingly earlier on, but by the time the big October battle started, Montgomery was very familiar with everything that Rommel was doing, and ultra did play a key part in that. It had been available to Auchinleck earlier, but Auchinleck had been a bit more hamstrung about how he could use it. It wasn't really until Montgomery arrived that there was a greater freedom to actually make maximum use of that ultra intelligence.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to have missed the first part. I got caught up. My father was a company commander in the 2nd 13th on the boundary. And your comment about active patrolling is what he always said, how they won. In fact, so much so that in later years he was in Hamburg. Yes, I'll be quick. Oh, sorry. He was in Hamburg, and the taxi driver, as he was being taken in to see some of his importer clients, said, "Are you Australian?" And Dad said, "Yes, of course." And he said, "Oh, very good soldiers, the Australians." It turned out that the taxi driver was a corporal in the very group that attacked that section of the perimeter.
Right.
And what Dad had not learnt till then was that the Germans had the Italian maps, and they had company positions on the Italian company fortresses along the line. And they did and the Germans are very straight up and down in their thinking. And so every Australian soldier had an automatic weapon. They'd captured a whole lot of Italian and other ones. And the night that Rommel actually sent the tanks through, Dad's orders were, wait till the tanks have gone past, don't jump up, then jump up, because the infantry are always at least 200 metres behind the tanks. They don't go in close formation. And then they stopped. The infantry stopped. The tanks kept running around. They didn't have good communications. They ran out of fuel and eventually were captured. But the other very quick point is the respect for each side, that for many decades after World War II, the Africa Corps invited members of the 9th Div to their reunions and vice versa. Thank you.
Which marked a big change when the 9th Division came back and was then fighting the Japanese in New Guinea. It was, yes, a very different enemy.
Just on a slightly broader scale, after the British couldn't be defeated in 1940, German Grand Admiral Erich Raeder thought that the Mediterranean was the one area that they could be beaten. However, on the 18th of December 1940, Hitler signed Operational Directive Number 21 ordering the invasion of the Soviet Union. In view of that, did the Axis really have realistic objectives of getting any further into Egypt and certainly not the oil fields of the Middle East?
Well, the invasion of Russia was obviously the big strategic move, but I think Hitler also was being lobbied strongly by some of his generals to invade Malta, and Malta was an essential, tiny island, but essential to control of the Mediterranean. And he chose not to do that. And Malta stayed. It meant Britain had a foothold in the Mediterranean. It meant they had a base to attack German shipping convoys. And so I think the failure to invade Malta was another issue.
Hi, I'm not much of a military historian, but there was a big debate when the US entered the Second World War about the importance of North Africa to the whole overall winning of the war. And Churchill was very much insistent that North Africa was the key, and the US weren't quite so on board. So to what extent is all of this really vital to the whole outcome as it went on? I mean, there was the D-Day landings and all the rest of it, but how important was that Alamein victory that then led to the retreat of the Germans and the Italians?
Well, I think you can certainly argue legitimately that the Allies had to defend the oil fields. If Rommel had got across the Suez Canal and into the Middle East, that would have been a disaster. But I think Churchill was looking for a victory wherever he could get one, and the Allies were being hammered everywhere. They were being hammered in Europe. Russia had been invaded, and the Japanese had taken the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, Malaya. They were in Burma. They'd taken the Philippines from the Americans. I think Churchill wanted a victory wherever he could get one. It was going to be some years, going to be 2 years before there was any possibility that the Allies would be ready to invade continental Europe. And the North Africa was a place where he could see a victory. And for the purposes of morale, among other things, he wanted it.
I've got a question from Catherine in Hobart, who has seen your Capignon on YouTube, I guess, or perhaps on our website. Your story there about Korea, and now this one about El Alamein, and wonders why is it that these battles are so important and yet so little known about in Australia?
I think in Australia there's as I've found out to my cost with Capillon, there's a huge the dominance of the First World War, the Second World War, and to a lesser extent the Vietnam War in Australian interest is so huge that the Korean War. I wrote that book, and it is strategically it was a very important war. It happened just after the Second World War, could have had calamitous consequences, and yet Australians, I think, just are less interested in it. And there are certain battles in the Second World War. There's a great interest in Tobruk. There's a great interest in Kokoda, and so battles like El Alamein are seen perhaps largely as a British affair, which is not true. And people, I think, Australia in general have just been less, have shown less curiosity about some of those other battles. There's just such a huge suction towards the well-known campaigns.
I guess they got a suburb in Melbourne, Alamein.
There's a suburban railway station in Melbourne. Then there's the Alamein Fountain in King's Cross. But if you look around for other memorials to what was a tremendously important battle in Australia, there are none.
Yeah, I thought it was you're right, I thought it was a suburb. It was just a railway station. But everyone stops there, yeah. Now, where do we go from here? We're all out?
Sorry. But what you mentioned in answer to the question about why people wouldn't volunteer. There was a very strong militia, civilian militia, pre-World War II. And nearly all, there were very few, Blamey of course was a regular soldier, but there were very few regular soldiers, and a lot of them were not much chop. And whereas there are a lot of lawyers and business people and doctors and all sorts of people who'd been in the militia for a number of years leading up to World War II, had achieved major or even a colonel rank. And you look at the number of brigadiers who were lawyers, for example, in 9th Div and elsewhere, and 6th Div in particular. I think that was part of it. They felt a duty to their country, but they'd also been in service.
Was there a question mark at the end of that? I wasn't sure. It was an interesting point. It was, and it's certainly true.
Of course, they got volunteers, but they.
I think the question is.
The officers.
Just hang on a second. I think the question is: did lawyers win the war for there? Was it lawyers who defeated Rommel? Was the question? I think.
I think it was lawyers, butchers, drovers.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, question down the back.
My question is, could you please tell us a little bit more about Montgomery, his parents, where he came in the family, what school he went to? Gerard and I had this discussion earlier on about schools. It's a Melbourne question. Was he a sportsman? What military academy did he go to? Please explain a little bit more about his background.
I'm afraid you have exhausted most of my knowledge of Montgomery. I know what he did in the battle of, in the campaign in North Africa. I don't know much about his background. He was a very controversial figure after the war. Certainly, he was seen as a martinet, as a loner. He was deeply unpopular. I mean, I think as popular as he was with his troops, he was unpopular with those above him. And I think probably Churchill had very little time for him, except that he was winning battles for him. But afterwards, people certainly, you don't have to look very far to see people saying very poisonous things about the personality of Bernard Montgomery.
You talked of the war in Korea, and there was a question about the support for the Defence Forces now. To what extent does that reflect the heterogeneous society we have now? Is there a large interest in the Korean War from the Korean population? I know when Taiwan comes up, there's a huge interest by the Chinese population, particularly the ones who came here after Tiananmen. But otherwise, they're very disengaged from.
Sure. Well, I mean,
the
Korean War tends to be known as the Forgotten War, and I think with good reason. It's failed in the half a century, rather failed to capture the Australian imagination. I don't know whether it's more deeply remembered in Britain, but
more concerned about the Koreans here.
Yes, I don't know whether I suspect that that maybe they're keen to leave that behind when they come here. I don't know. I couldn't answer that.
It's true that the Vietnamese here are very conscious of the Vietnam War because they're all refugees, or the children or grandchildren of refugees, mainly. So we're coming to an end. So just finally, you've done Capingong and brought that back to the attention of Australians in a well-written book that people can understand, and likewise with Alamein. So anything around the corner? What else have you got in mind?
I'm having a look at what the 9th Division did when it came back. So the 9th Division, they had 3 weeks off after the incredible privations that they'd endured in North Africa. They had 3 weeks off, and then they were sent up to the Atherton Tablelands to start training for the Jungle War, and then they ended up in New Guinea. They had a tough life, those boys.
Well, many thanks for that. So thanks for tonight, and we'd love to have you back to talk on the next book. But for tonight, well done, and be able to explain such an important war in which Australians were involved, in which so many of us know so little. And well done tonight for a very comprehensive speech, which will make a great paper. And for the rest, good luck and thank you.
Thank you very
well
much.
Well done. Okay.